Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Your Places or Mine, otherwise ypompod, with me, Clive Aslett, visiting professor at the University of Cambridge.
And me, John Goodall, the architecture editor of Country Life magazine.
And this week we have a wonderful subject which is so central to all John's interests. He is the person who knows more about it than anybody in the world, because he has written a great book, The English Castle. And today, John, what are we talking about?
Well, we thought we would talk about Windsor Castle, but we're going to do something slightly...
What a subject.
Yes.
We should have 10 episodes.
No, well, indeed, I've twisted Clive's arm to allow me to have 2 episodes on this, and so we'll be sort of filling in the whole story, because we want to bring it right up to the present day. It is one of these castles that, you know, has a continuous history to the present.
Working castle,
It is to the working castle. And we thought that today we would try and do the first part of the story, which is really from the 11th century to the Civil War in the 1640s, when Windsor is very nearly destroyed. Indeed, Parliament, I think, votes to destroy it, but it never happens. And then to look in the second part from, you know, the restoration in 1660.
This astonishing revival.
A revival of it all the way through to the present day. And it's, after all, come through at least 3 major rebuildings since the Civil War.
And creates the silhouette of Windsor that we know today so well. And we think medieval, but actually many later accretions.
Exactly. I mean, it is one of those buildings that really transcends English history. It's just always there. It's always important. And, but located in the southeast of England, this densely occupied part of Britain, it's a possession beyond purchase.
Yes.
It has to fall through history, because you just couldn't create the park and you couldn't create the building.
So what would you say, John? I'm just looking at the biggest possible picture. What is the meaning of Windsor?
So Windsor Castle, we know, is founded by William the Conqueror in the immediate aftermath of the Norman conquest of England in 1066. And I think it's quite important to sort of locate it topographically. It's obviously in the Thames Valley, and Windsor Castle is built on what was originally a cliff at, believe it or not, the highest tidal point of the River Thames. Prior to the sort of reorganisation of the river subsequently. So in the Middle Ages, there was a tide just at Windsor. And it's an interesting phenomenon, and I can't really quite explain why, but this construction of castles on tidal points is a recurrent feature, of the Middle Ages. I went in Ireland.
I suppose there'd be crossings.
Yes, but I mean, it's quite
often. In the case of Windsor, obviously there's London Bridge, but they're often crossing points.
There is a crossing point, and there is a crossing point over the river and past the cliff, and so it's a naturally defensible site. But that sort of the conjunction with the highest tidal point of the river is maybe it has something to do with shipping. I'm not sure, but I mean, I was just going to say in Ireland, Lismore Castle. That's another place which is actually built on a tidal point.
Anyway, John, before we get on to that, just tell me, what is the real importance of Windsor in national life to Britain?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, we will come to this. I mean, I think it is the seat of the monarch. I mean, that clearly is the most important thing. But connected with that, and since the 14th century, it is also the seat of the Order of the Garter, which is this chivalric order. It still operates, of course, today. Its membership is a gift of the sovereign. And that the conjunction of this order with the seat of the monarchy has turned it really into a national monument, and brings important people in every generation, has brought important people in every generation to the castle and linked them to the castle in a very unusual way. So it's as it were, it's a castle that isn't really owned.
Yes.
It is an expression of monarchy and the Order of the Garter, which is the group of people who are in fellowship with the monarch.
Of course, it's an extraordinary thing these days that in this very congested part of the country, you can see it from one of the busiest motorways, and it is very near Heathrow Airport. So, I mean, it is strangely, its sort of prominent. Centrality has become even more pronounced.
As I was about to say, it is. I mean, I don't really like the planes flying over it when you're in it, but when you're in one of the planes flying over it, it is absolutely magnificent.
Yes,
and it does become a sort of, it's absurd in a way, but it becomes a sort of gateway building to England. It's the thing that everybody can recognise from up above. It's so enormous, and that scale is no coincidence. It's been invested in by monarchs, over and over and over again on the grandest possible scale.
Yeah. I mean, it's more than. Anyway, it's like a whole settlement.
It's a universe in itself, as all the greatest castles were. Historically.
Yes. So, John, reverting to the Normans, William I. What I mean, he. Did he build something? Does anything survive of his castle?
Well, probably within the earthworks of the castle we have today. But the reason he found something there is obviously it's a cliff. It's on a crossing of the Thames. It's the highest tidal point of the Thames. But in addition to this, there is an important Anglo-Saxon palace at what we now call Old Windsor. And Windsor Castle was in fact built in the neighbouring manor of Clwyd. And this is a peculiarity of it. We know that the Doomsday Survey of the 1080s describes the new castle of Windsor. But Windsor Castle takes its name from the palace in what we now call Old Windsor. In other words, it's a transposition of names. A castle is built in Clwyd, but it's called Windsor Castle in reference to the Anglo-Saxon palace. And over time, and there's a lease fee paid every year until the 1570s for leasing this little bit of land in the manor of Clwyd, being paid by the king, or the Queen, Elizabeth I, to the owners of the manor of Clwyd, because they've taken this plot of land within Clwyd. So that
I thought under the feudal system, the monarch owned everything.
He did, but it's still an important element of it. And so the crucial thing is that an Anglo-Saxon palace bestows its name on a Norman castle.
Yes, I see.
And that is
a massive continuity.
It's a point of continuity, and Windsor, from very early on, it has an enormous hunting park associated with it. It's a major castle, and it probably, in its original form, it's a motte and bailey, what we call a motte and bailey castle. That is to say, there's a bailey, which is a fortified enclosure, and a motte, which is an artificial hill on which you build a tower, quite possibly of timber in its original form, and it's a major castle in this important strategic position within the Thames Valley. And the Thames Valley, is a hugely fertile corridor, and of course it runs down to London and the connection with the sea. So it's a very important point, and the castle is basically being laid out. And what's interesting is that the Windsor, old Windsor, as it were, withers on the vine.
Yes.
And there are parallels for these kinds of situations where royal palaces sort of take over. There's a Norman castle that sort of takes over from Anglo-Saxon palace. Winchester is another place where there's a Norman castle which seems to take over from an Anglo-Saxon palace, which is very important.
Yes.
And in London itself, I mean, there's a slightly more complicated story, but of course there's Westminster, which is used by the English kings as their principal palace, but then there is also London Castle. So these sort of divided centres of power, palaces and castles existing sort of in parallel with one another.
And the Old Windsor is not at the top of this bluff.
Absolutely not. It's not in a defensible spot.
The Saxons didn't see the potential in that sense.
No, I mean, I think it is William the Conqueror wanting something defensible that can be used as that palace. It is a transposition of an Anglo-Saxon palace. And don't forget that although he conquers England and decimates the existing aristocracy, he always claims to be a rightful heir to the English throne. I mean, that's why he comes. He doesn't see himself as being an outsider. He sees himself as having vindicated a just claim to the English throne through war, through trial by ordeal in the Battle of Hastings.
Yes.
He won. God's on his side. It's a fair.
Do you think the fact that this castle was very, very visible was that a consideration, do you think? Or did that not come into people's minds at that point?
Well, I think it is very visible. It's on an artery. I mean, I think before its 19th century remodelling, it must have been a much lower building in a way, but it is still very substantial.
Yes.
And I mean, it's worth moving on from that really the person who really reformulates Windsor on a very grand scale. I mean, it's clearly an important castle in the 11th century, but William the Conqueror's son, Henry I, he credits himself with building Windsor Castle. And that's not true. We know he doesn't. But what actually he clearly does is he creates a very important palace structure within the Baileys of Windsor. Of course, today...
Is that the basis of the round tower that we see today?
Probably. So if you imagine...
The bottom bit of it.
Yes. If you imagine today, Windsor Castle is in plan very roughly like a figure of 8 with a motte or artificial mound at the intersection of the two elements of the figures of 8. So those two Baileys, what are called the upper and lower ward. In the Middle Ages, confusingly, there's also a middle ward, which it still exists by name, but it's actually sort of vanished as a topographical element. But probably in the 11th century, that upper and lower ward is created with a motte on the top, and that Henry I builds a grand palace within the building, within the upper, probably the upper ward at Windsor, and he marries his bride Adeliza of Louvain. There's a very elaborate wedding celebration in I think 1120.
It's not somebody we hear about a great deal.
No. And there's this palace. We think that the palace probably looked something like the kinds of buildings that have been constructed by Bishop Roger of Salisbury at places like Old Sarum and Devizes and things. These and Sherborne. These compactly planned. They're castles that look a little bit like monasteries, where if you imagine you have a cloister with residential buildings around it, and then instead of a church, a keep or great tower. Whether that's what it looked like in Windsor, we don't really know.
That's gone.
That seems to have vanished almost entirely. I say that slightly hesitantly because in all the archaeology that followed the fire, the most recent fire, there were various bits
in the 1990s.
There were things that were possibly discovered from it, but in fact, I think it's effectively it's all been erased again.
Yeah, because this has been built over and developed many times.
It is. And one of the things that's really difficult, I think, to imagine today is how existing buildings which have vanished constrained the redevelopment of the castle at different times.
Yes. And Henry I was very proud of it, obviously, from what you say.
It's an important building and it ticks along, but I mean...
the descriptions of it in his era?
Did
his contemporaries regard it as a wonderwork?
It's alluded to as and it's clearly something. I think it's the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon is the person who attributes Henry I with building the castle, and I think that even that kind of comment implies some total makeover that turns it into something qualitatively different from what's there before. So, I mean, it's an important redevelopment, but again, it's one of these slightly invisible things because we can't really see what that was like, and we can only guess, I think, at its elaboration.
And the best of times, it was one amongst many palaces which he would have visited.
It is, but we also know that it has a very special status for him because in 1121, he also founds a partner religious foundation at Reading Abbey. And Reading Abbey, which is where he's ultimately buried, and indeed Henry I's tomb is probably under one of the walls of Reading Jail, made famous, of course, by Oscar Wilde. But it's one of these peculiar things is that the Abbey at Reading is one of the major Benedictine foundations of England, and of course the Reformation, it's almost entirely destroyed. But the
Reading, how far? About 10 miles from Windsor, is it?
If that. But I mean, it's this typical thing of building a castle and having this religious foundation nearby. And Reading Abbey is an institution of incredible scale. And of course, what is fascinating is that the ruins, of course, it was all destroyed. There are great lumps of masonry now, but a lot of the carved facing stones from the Abbey Church were used to build a culvert through Reading. And in recent years, this was rediscovered. And the quality of the carving, things from the capitals, from the cloister, the elements of windows and doors, they are of superlative quantity. And don't forget, Henry I is someone ruling an enormous Anglo-Norman realm. I mean, he's an enormously powerful figure in European terms. And this is the place, where he's investing money.
Yes.
And he's going to be buried.
So out of everywhere that he could have gone, he's chosen this
spot.
Because typically Norman they were absolutely dreadful people, but they were also very religious, weren't they? Although they did horrible things.
I was about to say, it's a complicated thing. I mean, their power marches arm in arm with that of the Reformed Church. I mean, it's a very...
huge church builders.
And they are enormous church builders, and they're building in this style which is sub-Roman, because they're evoking, the power of Rome.
Going all the way back.
It is a very strange thing. Anyway, in short, it marks out Windsor at this very early date as an exceptionally important castle foundation.
Yeah, and a palace.
Yes.
So, what happens next?
Well, I think from there you need to speed forward to the 14th century. I mean, Windsor, it's besieged in the 13th century during the invasion of Prince Louis in 1216 to 17. It's one of the three castles that holds out. I mean, mustn't get too distracted by this, but of course...
But I mean, it was a successful military creation as well as being...
It is.
Everything else.
It is. And so King John falls out with everybody, and his opponents, barons, invite the son of the French king, Prince Louis, to come to England and be the English king. And Prince Louis arrives, and he sweeps the board. He takes Winchester, he takes London, he takes the whole of the southeast of England. And there are three castles that hold out against him. Dover, which controls his communications with France. Lincoln, which is actually held by a chatelaine who defends it against him. And Windsor. And these three castles are bitterly fought over, and they never fall. And as a consequence, his attempt to take the English throne collapses. King John dies, and his 8-year-old son, Henry III, comes to the throne. And at that moment, Henry III, actually, it is an important episode. In the aftermath of the damage caused by the siege, he rebuilds the wall of Windsor Castle, which is, if you go to Windsor today and you walk from either railway station, you come across a huge curtain wall, which is with great towers, which is built by Henry III. And he also invests...
He was, of course, a great builder, wasn't he?
He is an
discovered
enormously
from
important
other
builder.
podcasts.
And he builds in the lower ward of Windsor a palace with a cloister and a chapel, which is going to be very important because it's going to become St. George's Chapel in the future.
But it isn't yet.
So we have Henry I, we think, rebuilding in the upper ward, and we have Henry III in the 13th century rebuilding in the lower ward.
And then
we come to the figure who really creates the modern Windsor. It's Edward III.
This great warrior king.
Exactly. So after the disasters of Edward II's reign, the humiliation of English arms at Bannockburn, and the kind of implosion of Edward II's administration, Edward III comes to the throne, and he is a young king. He's initially, of course, under the control of his mother and her lover, Edward Mortimer, but he
sorts all that out.
He has this exciting coup d'etat, seizing Edward Mortimer and
banishing his mother
and brutally executing Edward Mortimer.
Quite right.
And then in the 1340s, there is this sort of rather extraordinary series of interconnected episodes. You need to understand that Edward III begins to present himself as a figure associated with King Arthur. Now, the legendary history of Windsor but there is a thread of the legend that makes Windsor Camelot, the seat of King Arthur. And Edward III begins to present himself as a Lancelot, as a knight. I mean, it's a very strange thing.
So what is this conveyed through? Is it through French romances?
Well, I think it reflects the delight. I mean,
transmit the stories.
Well, I think I think Arthur is an internationally famous figure, and what I think is very difficult to capture is that as a young king, the hedonism, the pleasure that these the courtiers take in elaborate tourneys and hastiludes. So what is important to hastilude, which is a kind of
say that's a word
you have not come across.
come across before.
So obviously in the 1340s, Edward III the tide begins to turn both in Scotland and also in two military victories at Crecy and Poitiers and against the French. And Edward III obviously launches himself in the 1330s into the 100 Years' War with France, this long period of intermittent hostilities. But he, in 1344, he has a tournament at Windsor, and he invites all the citizens of London to come and watch this tournament. And essentially, these tournaments that he's taking part in, we know from the wardrobe accounts that when the king fights these tournaments, or hastiludes, it's a variety of tournament, you need 2 teams of 12, and you also have sometimes you have elaborate dresses or costumes, so you could fight as Saracens, or we know that Edward III has plumes for his helmets made out of thousands and thousands of peacock feathers. I mean, these are completely extraordinary displays of wealth, and the whole point is that
but they were also games, weren't they? I mean, people didn't hold back.
Well, I think
or were they rather careful not to wound the king?
In the late 12th century, it is true, tournaments are basically warfare, but slightly, moderated. I mean, famously, William Marshall, I seem to remember, who's this sort of flower of English chivalry of the late 12th century, he deploys crossbowmen to cover his retreat in a Good grief. He's a very, very successful tournament fighter, and he makes his fortune through fighting tournaments. Because if you capture someone, you ransom their horse, and you take their possession. He's brilliantly successful. He comes from nowhere, and he's fantastically successful at this. So there are almost no rules. But by this date, it
really is people knocking the hell out of each other.
Yes, I think basically it's a kind of gambling. You're going in and trying to seize other people's possessions.
Oh, I see. So even though this isn't a war, if you get hold of somebody's horse, they've got to buy it back. Yeah. Oh, wow.
But I mean, by the 14th century, the kind of thing that Edward III's doing, I mean, there's a much clearer demarcation between, us and them. The people who can fight in these hastiludes are an exclusive set.
Yes,
and they're fighting these things in spectacular costumes, and
you could still get quite seriously knocked up, couldn't you?
You could, and that's consistently the case.
Yes,
but for this event, there is also constructed in the upper ward of Windsor, and this was discovered archaeologically not very long ago, a round table. It was discovered in the upper ward at Windsor recently archaeologically. This enormous round building, which is effectively, again, an evocation of the Arthurian Round Table.
In a building?
Right. Constructed very elaborately and slated. It's a permanent structure. And this is presumably being created for this, for this great entertainment.
Is that related to the table in Winchester?
Yes and no. The table in Winchester is also
restored, wasn't it?
Which is restored, and we also
by Henry VIII, I think.
So people may or may not know that there's a huge 1.5 ton oak table, a circular table, hung on the walls of the Great Hall at Winchester, and it's now painted. It's a Tudor painting scheme. It looks like a dartboard in green and white, with the names of some of the knights of the Round Table running around the edges, and in the central section, Henry VIII as King Arthur. This table has been dendrodated, I think I'm right in saying, to the 1290s, and is almost certainly also created for one of Edward I's tournaments. So, these ideas are not entirely new. But I mean, the building, this round building that's constructed, is of a different order from that. And then in 1346, so connected to this earlier tournament, there is established the Order of the Garter, the Chapel of St. George and the Order of the Garter, and it grows directly out of what I've described as this tournament. But the connection between the two, 1348, not 1340.
So it's after the Battle of Crecy.
Exactly.
Which was 1346.
Indeed.
So
this is again...
It was his gang who'd been with him at Crecy, was that the idea?
Exactly. Well,
and they were going to commemorate this through this order?
Well, the Order of the Garter is, you may remember, its motto is Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it. And the implication is that this is of Edward III's claim to the French throne. The Order of the Garter has as its colour blue, as opposed to English red, which is again blue being a French thing. And the Order, as it's constituted, this new college and the Order of the Garter associated with it, is to have basically 4 groups of 13 people. Now, 13 is the number of Christ and the apostles, and they're going to be 13 canons or priests, 12 canons and priests with a dean, and they're going to have then each of them is going to have a deputy, so there's a clergy, but then at the same time they're going to be 2 lots of 13, the king and 12 knights, and the Prince of Wales and 12 knights. And of course, those numbers echo one another, they're resonant, and in the choir, today, it's a later choir, there are actually alternate stalls with helms on, and this is 15th century stalls and pinnacles, which show the alternation of the clergy and the knights. In the choir where they sit. But the point is that also that 13 is the number for hastiludes, so that you can go out and the king and the Prince of Wales can be 2 teams.
The hastiludes have returned.
So do you see what I mean? It's this sort of intoxicating combination of devotion and warfare and sport, all bound up with this idea of reviving or asserting Edward III's claim to the French throne. It's a very peculiar thing, but this is to be hugely important. It's there at this time in Europe. There are lots of orders of chivalry being created. Many of them have slightly strange regalia, and of course, the Order of the Garter has a garter as the name.
How odd!
It is in every way deeply peculiar.
And really, so that's not really explained then. The legend of it is not true.
Well, there are lots of explanations for why, but I mean, the whole point of it is that it's for a little group of knowing. It's for an inner circle. Who
would know the joke or the reference?
Exactly, or the reference. They don't. It doesn't need to be explained to anybody else. It's exclusive. It's only you
that's the whole point.
Are part of it.
Yes.
And I mean, I suppose the extraordinary thing about the Order of the Garter is, whereas all these other orders have come, it's like the Order of the Golden Fleece or something, again, these emblems that they're named after. But as whereas all the others have come and gone, the Order of the Garter still has an annual ceremony every year. And it's worth saying that the chapel that Henry III has founded in the lower ward really is rebuilt by Edward III as the chapel of St George. St George being again a martial saint. It's Edward. Previously, the patron saint of England had been Edward.
The Confessor.
Edmund, King of East Anglia, Bury St Edmunds, and St George, of course, is a martial saint, and again combining these ideas of chivalry and militarism, Christianity. So he's a new saint, and that this Henry III's chapel becomes and the cloister of Henry III's palace are reworked as accommodation for this new college.
Yes,
in the lower ward of Windsor, where they remain.
Yes,
and we'll talk about that more in the second part. Yeah. But that's all rebuilt, and the style of architecture, and as far as we can recreate it, is this defining perpendicular form, this new aesthetic of English architecture. And all this, it should be said, coincides almost exactly with, in 1346, the outbreak of the Black Death in England. So there's this really bizarre concatenation of events.
Which I've heard it suggested was brought in on all the glorious textiles that they had looted in France.
Well, it's possible.
That would be...
It would be poetic justice, wouldn't it? But I mean,
of course, the French getting their own back in a perfidious way.
I mean, it's a sort of fascinating coincidence of political events of Edward III's successes in the field in the 1340s. His Arthurian interests, his the foundation of the Order of the Garter, and then this Black Death, which probably wipes out up to half the population of England,
including some of his cronies.
Including some of his cronies.
I mean, it wasn't restricted to the lower orders, was it?
No. But we must.
But yes,
in the second part, we will now talk. So St George, you must imagine the colleagues coming together in the lower ward, but we'll look in the second half at what happens in the upper ward at Windsor, which is even more significant in the 1350s, as money from the French kings, the ransoming of the King of France, who's of course captured in the field, this vast sum of money pours into Edward III's coffers, and he turns it to an extraordinary architectural account, one of the grandest palaces in contemporary Europe.
How exciting. So, John, we have Edward III. We have this huge avalanche of money coming into the country from France. Wonderful. So what else does he do with it?
So he begins to rebuild. Earlier on, he's rebuilt what's called the High Tower, the round tower on the motte, the artificial motte in the castle, where there's a clock, in fact, a novelty in English palace designed to regulate life.
What, from Edward III's time?
From Edward III's time, a chiming clock. Yeah. And within the round tower, there still sits now the Royal Library, but you can still see the 14th century buildings constructed within that structure. But in fact, all this becomes rather unimportant. With all this money from the ransom of the King of France, suddenly he begins to build in the upper ward the building that still form the architectural bones of the castle today. So when you walk into the upper ward, you're actually seeing the bones of a 14th century palace, which is, the parallels for it are places such as the Papal Palace at Avignon. This is a building of European scale, advertising his prestige. It's constructed within the almost square outline of walls built in the late 12th century by Henry II, walls with square towers punctuating them at regular intervals. But the palace has two principal elements. Along one side, it'd be the north side of the upper ward, are three contiguous courtyards constructed all within one structure. And then enclosing the other two sides of that upper ward are lodging ranges for all the members of the household, which are rather lower built. Now, those three courtyards have as their main front, along the front of the building, they have the three principal chambers of a royal palace. They have the hall, the chapel, and the great chamber of the king.
So this is another chapel.
It's another chapel. And they're all organised together. And the early drawings of this show that, again, they're done in the perpendicular style. And one of the features of the perpendicular is consistency of detail. And what's really striking about it, in other words, is you have this long frontage with two gatehouses built into it, and then this whole sequence of windows that all look exactly the same. An enormous frontage of I can't remember how long it is, but several hundred feet, where you just have consistent windows running all the way along it. And if you get into the building, they contain the hall, the great chamber, and the chapel for the king.
You can't really tell from the outside what they contain there.
And this is a really important departure from English architecture. And in fact, it's something that subsequent masons clearly react against, because historically, in English buildings, you've tended to define different elements of a building by different window forms. So chapels would have, you'd be able to look at the outside of a great English house, and not only would it be very uneven and have different elements, and the hall might have a tall roof, but the windows of all those different elements would look quite different. And so you could say, well, there's the hall from the outside, there's the hall, there's the chamber, there's the chapel. This actually integrates them all together in this solid, consistent range. And the two gatehouses that punctuate this are integral with that long range. And we know that the King's Council Chamber, rather nice detail, is on the upper floor of one of those gatehouses. And the reason for that is that at the upper floor, no one can listen at the door because it's at roof level, but also that if you have a break in a council meeting, you can wander out onto the leads of the roofs and take a breath of fresh air. Don't you think it'd be a rather more elegant way of having these, come on, these podcasts, would be just step out onto...
We'd wander around and we'd have a great view of the Thames Valley before us, all fertile, and peasants working away in the fields. But of course, the idea that you could, in most medieval buildings, or many medieval buildings, you could tell what the different parts were, was enormously important to later theorists of the Gothic revival, like Pugin, who thought this was a great argument in favour of the Gothic style, because it was honest. You didn't try to conceal things behind a uniform facade as you did in classicism. Yeah. You could, the different parts of the building were obvious. You could look at it and just see how a building was put together, because it's sort of put together with these different elements, which just all look different from each other. But it's very interesting that that wasn't Edward III's idea at all.
It wasn't Edward III's idea. And it's important to say that the person who is clearly overseeing all the building work at Windsor is this hitherto obscure figure called William of Wykeham.
Oh.
And William of Wykeham is going to become absolutely the most important of Edward III's sort of inner circle. And he is catapulted through the ranks of the clergy. He's not initially a cleric at all, I seem to remember. In fact, I think he's made a bishop even before he's ordained a priest. But he becomes Bishop of Winchester, which is, again, in European terms, a massively wealthy...
So, John, what was he? If he wasn't a cleric, what was he?
Well, I think he's just... he becomes a cleric in order to become a bishop, if you see what I mean.
Yes. No, I can see that.
I think I'm right in saying that.
But he didn't rise from a sort of poor background.
Well, he doesn't come from a very distinguished background.
But not a distinguished background.
And his rise is very much as in the context of the Windsor building works. What's really important about understanding that connection is that as Bishop of Winchester, he becomes patron of two extremely famous and defining educational foundations. Winchester College in Winchester, founded, I think, 1381, and a new college, Oxford, founded, I think, in 1379. I may have got those dates slightly wrong. But those two buildings both take the form of Edward III's palace in Windsor.
Oh, interesting.
Because if you walk into their court and go into New College, which is by far the grandest college to date established in Oxford and sets a new standard for educational foundations, you walk in and you have the hall and the chapel linked together as a tall range on one side of the building, and enclosing the courtyard are lodging ranges. We've already talked about the consistency of the detail at Windsor, but what's really interesting is that both New College and Winchester, the hall and the chapel windows are treated differently. In other words, already they looked at Windsor and they thought it's not quite what we wanted. What I think has been, it's also worth saying that, very unusually, the Windsor Great Hall of the King's Great Hall has a relatively low pitched. The fire demonstrated, in fact, that the pitch of the roof had been changed, but the roofs are low pitched, and this is very unusual. As I say, allow people to walk on the leads. The walls of the present building, totally remodeled as it is, correspond to those created by Edward III. And indeed, today, all Edward III's principal apartments are actually raised up on first floor level above vaulted undercrofts. And you can see those vaulted undercrofts today.
Was it a bit like the Tower of London? I mean, with that low pitch of roof, was there a parapet and people wouldn't have seen the roof at all?
Exactly. Though, I mean, this is essentially, yes. And that's also an important aesthetic decision.
Yes.
Whereas historically most great halls, and if you look at Westminster Hall we've talked about, it has this massive high-pitched roof today.
Yes.
But, I mean, these things are clearly much lower and concealed. The fire, one extraordinary revelation of the fire is that the kitchen, Edward III's kitchen, which it was assumed that everything had been rebuilt in Windsor, but absolutely unbelievably, this is not publicly accessible because it's still a working kitchen for state dinners and things. The kitchen in the upper ward at Windsor is still Edward III's kitchen with this enormous louvered roof to let the heat out. And that was a sort of a revelation that everybody had assumed that this roof had been replaced. And then suddenly it turned out that the 14th century roof of this great kitchen, which again gives a sense of the scale of the household there, was all still in place. I mean,
Sure.
Two other details are worth sort of adding is that there was these two gatehouses. One of them went into the services, and one of them took you into the hall and into the main apartments. But the king also had another little private entrance right on the outer corner of this upper ward, which is called the Rose Tower. And the Rose Tower, again, it was discovered that it still possesses wall paintings, 14th century wall paintings of roses on the walls, and it's a little sort of, almost a little private edicule, and it was obviously a prestigious room the king could withdraw to, but also there's a staircase within it taking you in.
Thinking of William of Wykeham, who was organising all this, I mean, what was his status at the time? Was he really an administrator? I mean, he rose to become the Chancellor, didn't he?
He did. He becomes an incredibly important
and colossally rich
figure, and enormously rich. But I mean, it does seem that he cuts his teeth essentially on this architectural project in the upper ward
as the organiser of building works. I mean, it's an interesting way to royal favour,
and it's clearly important again in more ways than just through him, because as we've said, this is the period of the Black Death, people are dying. He seems to forge at Windsor a very close connection with a mason called William Winford, and William Winford effectively seems to become his designer. And if you imagine the royal works, they're on an enormous scale, and masons and craftsmen are being pressed into service at Windsor. And the result is that almost everybody who's anybody in the mid 14th century comes to Windsor. Don't forget, lots of people are also being killed off by the plague. So the effect of the building works at Windsor is to centralise building operations around the figure of the royal works.
Yes.
And that William Winford is one of the major figures who then goes on to build these other buildings in the Manor of Windsor for William of Wykeham when he's been promoted to the bench of bishops. So you have, in effect, a sort of centralisation of architectural practice through these enormously ambitious building works. And the aesthetics of Windsor are apparent, for example, in a whole group of major castles in the north of England, places like Castle Bolton, which is being designed probably by a mason called John Lewin, and they take lots of details from Windsor and this massive block-like forms of the castle, and reproduce them in a totally different context. Brandsputh, Sheriff Hutton. There are all these late 14th century buildings that are basically following Windsor.
So Edward III has stamped his personality on Windsor, and we have the ceremony of the Garter, the Order of the Garter, and we have this great palace. So what happened in the later Middle Ages?
So Windsor remains...
Can anybody live up to that example?
The two people who add significantly to it, I mean, we know, Edward VI. So basically, later monarchs use Windsor, and it's very important for its hunting park. There are diplomatic events that take place there, and the Order of the Garter remains very important. But Edward IV, so in the late 15th century, he goes and fights. He takes an army to France and is bought off. He has an alliance with the Duke of Burgundy, and he's bought off. The Duke of Burgundy fails to turn up, and Edward IV allows himself to be bought off at the Treaty of Picquigny. And with the money, again, there's a theme here, with the money that comes into the royal coffers, and as a statement of thanks, he invests huge sums of money in rebuilding St. George's Chapel. The original chapel of the Order of the Garter becomes a lady chapel to a massive new building, which is a chapel in name, but it's a great church in form. That building work is going to continue right through into the early 16th century, into the reign of Henry VIII. But it's Edward IV who plans his tomb there and, begins to rebuild the church in this incredibly sophisticated and opulent form. It's one of the great late medieval buildings of Europe. So that's one thing that's going on. And in the process, he has to reorganize the lower ward. The college buildings have cannibalized Henry III's buildings. And I mean, it's all very, very, very complicated. But there's the Horseshoe Cloister at the west end of St. George's Chapel today, which is built by Edward IV. And the chapel is begun by him.
But we've entered the Wars of the Roses now.
We've entered the Wars of the Roses. This is all being done, I think it's beginning in 1475. But then we have Henry VI Henry VII. Henry VI is buried at Windsor, but that's another story. He becomes one of the principal saints of Windsor in the late Middle Ages. This useless king, Henry VI, who goes mad and brings us all into the Wars of the Roses. And indeed, Windsor has two shrines, one to John Shorn, who's a priest, who's, I seem to remember his hat. His boot, he put on his boot, he conjures out gout and the devil. He conjures the devil out of a boot, and people can put on his boot. And Henry VI, there's a hat, I seem to remember. If you have terrible headaches, you can put on his hat. And there's also the cross of
ironic for the
cross, the cross of Gneth, which is a Welsh cross taken by Edward I during the conquest of Wales. Anyway,
we move on.
There's so much you
we're
could
now
say
in the realm
about
of the
that.
Tudors.
And Henry VII is the first person who needs to extend the upper ward of Windsor. Henry VII, people find him very disturbing because he doesn't live a public life in quite the same way that monarchs before him has done. And he builds a tower, which is for him to withdraw into.
Oh, count his money.
Count his cash. Attached to the Edward III's apartments. And so this has been much reworked since, but he creates a sort of privy tower like a keep, which sits just outside the outer ward. And then his Elizabeth I, who does very little building, it makes various extensions and alterations to Windsor too. It's quite interesting. Someone who we think of as not building at all. In fact, the Royal Library and shows evidence of her alterations.
So how was she using Windsor?
Well, I mean, it's it's still really important for the Order of the Garter. I mean, I think that is the thing that is consistently important, that people have to come to Windsor for the Garter ceremony every year. And so the court always has, the court consistently is much more interested in London and other palaces around London, what's going on there. But Windsor becomes this sort of really important satellite building.
Yes.
And I mean, there are early views of it, and it already shows this, I think, much as we see it today.
Did people withdraw in times of plague?
Well, the court does move out in times of plague, but in fact it moves to many different places.
Yes.
Hertford Castle, for example. I mean, it can move all over the place.
Dozens of palaces it could go to.
Exactly. And I mean, no doubt Windsor is one. I'm not sure. But I suppose the point is that Edward III's apartments are so big that you can pretty much carry on using those all through the Middle Ages and beyond. And Henry VII added a privy apartment, which is really nice because you can, get away from all your courtiers when you're living there. And there are other alterations that are being made. There's, for example, a water conduit that's installed. And there's a magnificent 16th century aerial view of Windsor showing, the whole complex with St. George's Windsor and, and the upper ward and the conduit and all these things and the parkland around it. I suppose that's the other important point to make, is that the parkland has always been a really important attraction. And one of the nice things for English monarchs is that they could dump their households in the castle, and then they could go off and have a nice time hunting and stay in a lodge somewhere in Windsor Park and have nothing to do with their household. Yes. So it's a place of escape as well.
Oh, interesting.
But it's not, the Stuarts, again, use it in much the same way, I think, for the Order of the Garter.
But it's getting a bit run down by this time.
Well, I don't know. I mean, run down. It's a great house that is being maintained.
Yeah. Tell us about the Civil War. The English Civil War, Charles I.
The Civil War, what?
And Oliver Cromwell.
Ooh. Windsor does not really. It does play a small role in the fighting, but basically it's garrisoned, but it's not an important in the fighting itself. It's not such an important centre, what it becomes important as is a symbol of monarchy.
Yeah.
This
was it trashed?
Well,
like Greenwich, for example.
So St George's, Windsor survives the Reformation uniquely as an English religious institution. But at the Civil War, Christopher Wren's father is the Dean of Windsor. And basically, everybody is booted out during the Commonwealth, and Parliament passes a law. The Commons discusses and passes, agrees to demolish the castle. This actually never happens. And
It would be quite a difficult thing to do.
Well, it would have been an enormous task, but of course there are castles being demolished up and down the kingdom. And the St George of Windsor, I think the lead is stripped from the roofs. Charles I, of course, is buried in Windsor after his execution. Famously a snowstorm in January, he's buried there. But I think one of the reasons he's buried there is that Parliament thinks it can control access to his body. They've executed a king.
Yes.
And then what bury him in a royal place, but also if you bury him in a castle, well, it can't become a focus of attention.
Of cult.
All the buildings are. I think Evelyn, the diarist John Evelyn, he describes going to Windsor and walking through it and says, what a sad it is. Basically, by the end of the 1650s, it's basically becoming derelict. And
so we have a sad ending to this episode, John.
Yes,
but the next episode
is going
to be revival and renaissance, and extraordinary things are going to happen.
It really is, and it's going to be an extraordinary revival and bring the castle right up to the present day.
Thank you very much.